Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, rather unusually pay tribute to some members on the opposite bench. They have kept the flame alive, if we can put it that way, of the 0.7 share that should be paid. It's never easy to speak out when you're a member of the governing party. I have been in that position. It would be churlish to say that it's down to patronage or threats. It's ultimately about loyalty to a cause that you stand by, and therefore I pay tribute to those members who have spoken out against the administration and indeed in respect of their own principles in supporting what actually wasn't just principle but was a manifesto commitment. It can't have been easy, but they actually have the power to change. Those of us on this bench, we have the power to protest and to hold to account, but the fundamental change that will be required, it cannot come today, has to come from them, and I encourage them to keep the faith, and I pay tribute to the efforts that they've made to date. It is essential because, as others have mentioned, there are reasons for it. It is a moral necessity. It is an economic imperative, and it's certainly also a health and well-being requirement for ourselves, not just for the entire world. And it is the case that it was trumpeted at G7 by the Prime Minister, but indeed only a few weeks thereafter it appears that we are going into reverse. Now, I do accept that there is a logic and there is rationale and indeed right in what the government argue, that the 0.7 commitment, I think, is met by only two countries. If my memory serves me well, it's Denmark and France. But simply because others are wrong doesn't mean it's right that this country should seek to follow them. This is a time actually to take a lead because it is a necessity not only for others, as has often been said by almost every speaker, but also for ourselves. So I ask the government to stick to the principles that were stood on and supported by all parties in the last election and that remain in their manifesto. Of course it is in our own economic interests. As those who have trumpeted Brexit as part of this new global Britain of free trade around the world, let's remember that there can only be free trade if we can stimulate demand. If countries are too poor to be able to buy our goods and services, then we cannot generate the work that exists here. So we actually have to use some Keynesian logic in economics to make sure that they have the resource available to actually, in many instances, acquire things for us, as well as supporting the measures that many speakers have spoken to about addressing starvation, flooding, all the dangers that so often blight too many of these lands. We will benefit economically from giving aid, and we will face consequences if we do not, and therefore it is in our own interest. But it is also primarily a moral necessity. It is an unfair world. The opulence in this House, and most especially in the House just along the corridor, confirms the wealth that has been generated over many years. That we see north and south of the border, we see it in every city. We have benefited over many years, and of course, in these past years, people worked hard, people did show endeavour and indeed risk. But let's also remember that one of the reasons that we have this wealth here, not just in this city, but in Glasgow and Edinburgh and across the whole of this country, one of the reasons we have it is because we exploit it, because we enforced deals upon colonies and indeed in other nations. We took from them. We made sure that we stripped them of their natural resources, and we ensured that they actually had to buy the product that was created from ourselves. So in actually giving development aid isn't about simply giving charity. It isn't about charity. It's about taking responsibility for actions that this country participated in, along with others in the developed world. Because we did it, the French did it, the Dutch did it, the Belgians, and on it went. And the Western and developed world accrued their wealth at the expense of what is now the developing world, because we took from them and we insisted upon, we benefited from their natural resource. So this isn't about, as I say, giving charity. This is about their right. It's our obligation to actually give back to try and make that fairness. The government talks about a levelling up agenda, and they are right. There has to be a levelling up agenda, not simply in the north of England, but indeed across the border between Scotland and England. But there fundamentally has to be a levelling up around this globe in terms of between the northern and southern hemispheres, because the wrong and the poverty that exist, that manifests itself in the UK in a north-south divide, exists on planet Earth in a north-south divide, and it's our obligation and our necessity that we take action to reverse that. but it's also about health and well-being. Because I was reading just some statistics I saw yesterday that 85% of shots or vaccinations have been carried out in upper and middle income tier countries. 0.3%, not even 0.7%, 0.3% have been carried out in lower income countries. We've already seen what's happened with Delta variant. If we want to make sure, as epidemiologists fear, that we do not face a further variant that won't be able to be dealt with by our vaccination, then we have to take steps to ensure that we support the health and welfare within those countries, and that's why it's in our own interest to ensure that we provide that 0.7. And finally, given the short time left, I just want to comment on the position being made about women and girls. That is fundamental. I recall as Justice Secretary dealing with violence reduction, and I remember speaking to officers, and we made great progress in Scotland in tackling violence reduction. There's still a long way to go, but I say this because it's a microcosm. Because we were doing all these youth five-a-side football at night to stop young men drinking, participating in gang violence or whatever. And then the light bulb moment happened for some police officers when they suddenly realised that they were sitting, keeping the lads out of trouble, and standing around waiting to speak to the lads were all the young teenage girls. And they suddenly realised that if we don't attract and deal with these teenage girls, we'll be dealing with their children in 16 years or whatever else. And anybody who's ever seen the Justice and Analytical Services correlations between youth offending, criminal offending, and indeed teenage pregnancies, it's stark. That is a microcosm. If we want to make these countries better, then we have to pour resource into women and children, as we do in terms of making a fairer country in this land. So as I say, it's for these reasons, for our own economic well-being, for a moral purpose, but equally for our own health and well-being, that we have to have 0.7.